إنما هو التوحيد وتوحيد العبادة بالذات.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. وبعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Welcome back to another session of the series on Islamic history. This is again being presented by the Tawheed Project, and we are in the midst of really the beginning of a series of lectures on the concept of history from an Islamic perspective. In the previous session, we had covered the Quran, and this is all from topic 1 as a broad introduction of history and historiography. How do Muslims know their past? And so we covered the Quran in session 1, and now we're going to begin session 2, which is a look at the Maghazi and Sirah literature. And in this part 1 of session 2 is going to be a look at the importance of the isnad, or what we call the isnad system. This will be followed in time, inshallah, by a look at the transmitters of the Maghazi literature amongst the Tabi'un, the second generation of the Muslims. And then the third part of session 2 will be the early compilers of the Sirah and the Maghazi. So, to get into the topic, Maghazi and Sirah. Probably most of you have heard of these terms. We talk about Sirah, the Sirah of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so what we're going to do in this session is get a general understanding of what exactly we mean by Maghazi and Sirah, and then focus particularly on the transmission of knowledge. This is a very important topic within the context of developing an Islamic understanding of history. Most of us will be familiar with the hadith collections. People are always talking about the Sahih Bukhari or Sahih Muslim, talking about the other collections of Abu Dawud, Tirmidhi, An-Nasa'i, Ibn Majah, and many other hadith collections by famous scholars of the past. But it seems that for many Muslims, understanding exactly what we're talking about, how did these hadith collections come to be? Who were these scholars? And then also, more importantly, how does all this information about early Islam, about the first century of Islam, about the companions of Prophet Muhammad, about Muhammad himself, how does this information get transmitted from the time of the Sahaba, the time of the companions, to the second generation of Muslims, right, the Tabi'un, and then to have that passed on to the third generation, Tabi'ut Tabi'in, and of course that continues on. Right. So this early period is what we're going to be looking at, how Muslims have understood the transmission of knowledge, right, and what exactly is this isnad system. Right. And this is very important to understand. In this session, we're just going to look at, the broad overview of the topic. Later on, we have scheduled more in-depth discussions on the isnad, on the hadith, and on the hadith collections. But also, what we're doing in this first topic of history and historiography is developing the idea of the Islamic perspective on history. And this means understanding that early history within the correct context of how we are to think and behave, what attitudes we are to have as Muslims. And this, of course, as we saw in the last session on the Quran, comes out of the revelation, comes out of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's revealing of information to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam that becomes the Quran, and what the Quran says about history and how we are to think about the past. Right? So now we have a different topic, right? But it's equally going to be a topic of theology, of belief, right? Of our aqidah, right? And also now of history. Right? The historical act, the human act, you might say, of having knowledge from one generation get passed on to another generation. Right? And of course, what you might say complicates the issue to a certain extent is that the Arab society at the time of Prophet Muhammad and the companions, radiallahu anhum, were an illiterate society. There were no written records of any kind. And so we talk about an oral tradition, right? Things that were experienced, things that were learned and memorized and then transmitted orally by word of mouth, right, from the companions to the second generation. In the course of that first century of Islam, we have the transition to a written society. Right? Because of the Quran, primarily because of the Quran, the Arabs, the Muslims, become a literate society. They make this transition and they begin to write everything down. Right? The recorded compilation of the Quran completed at the time of the Caliphate of Uthman. Writing down of the hadith, writing down of the early histories. Right? But this is a process that takes time, it takes decades, it's a multi-generational process. And so this is what we're going to try to get an understanding of, at least in its general terms. And of course, the other theme that we're looking at in these discussions is to contrast an Islamic perspective on history with a modern secular perspective. Right? And in this particular topic of the Isnad and the transmission of knowledge from the Sahaba to the Tabi'un, we have a very important issue to discuss. And this is the issue of Western scholarship, what is sometimes referred to as Orientalism, and what did the Western scholars of the 19th century, 20th century, right up until today, for a large portion of Western writers, holding on to a secular view, but as we'll see, almost inevitably becoming an anti-Islamic view, with casting doubts on the validity of that transmission of knowledge. And there are many nuanced understandings that Western scholars today have. But what we'll be looking at is, at the core of it, is this constant effort to cast doubt on the reality of what had happened in the 7th century, as Islam expands. So, with that broad overview, let's take a look first at what do we mean by Maghazi and Sirah. I just gave two very basic definitions here. The Maghazi is information about military expeditions, meaning the Ghazwa, it comes from the word the Ghazwa, the raids, the campaigns, the expeditions carried out by Muhammad ﷺ and the Sahaba in the Medinan period. Of course, we know Muhammad ﷺ is preaching in Mecca. Because of the persecution, he has to make the hijrah. He moves to Medina, and that starts the last period of his life and of his prophethood. And it is in that context of the Medinan period that the war with the pagan Meccans, with the Quraysh, and their allied tribes takes place. All right. Now, of course, the Maghazi is more than just the particular battles. It's going to carry on into the early period after the time of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, but then the history is going to change in the way the early Muslims, the Sahaba, understood that history and what they were creating, what they were making as Islam expands after the death of Prophet Muhammad. But primarily we're talking about the military expeditions, right? But also the aim of each expedition. So the Maghazi literature, the hadith that are reporting these campaigns and talking about where they're going, what was the goal, capture a Quraysh caravan, or what was the purpose of that expedition. What were the results of those expeditions? Were they successful? Did they engage in battles? Were people killed? So what actually happened? Right? Who were the leaders? Who were given positions of commanding particular armies or expeditions that went out? Who were the participants of this? Right? And any other related information. Right? So the Maghazi is very extensive literature, but it is primarily focused on the military aspect. Right? By way of example, in Sahih al-Bukhari, he does include a book specifically focused on the Maghazi, and he calls it Kitab al-Maghazi. Right? Now, of the 6 major collections, he's the only one that has a dedicated book on the Maghazi. The other collections of Muslim and Abu Dawud and Nasa'i, Tirmidhi, Ibn Majah have information about these battles, but they don't have it collected in one particular book. Right? And this is also not synonymous with jihad, right? Or what is also called the Sirah, the other types of campaigns or activities, aspects of the biography of Muhammad. The Maghazi literature is not particularly focused on what we might call the fiqh issues or the legal issues of jihad and things like that. So they're really descriptions of the military campaigns. Right? Now when we get to the Sirah is more extensive than the Maghazi literature. Right? And so we could understand the Sirah as expanding on that Maghazi literature by giving a full biography of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right? The Sirah is usually divided into 4 major sections. Right? And as we go through, and again we're going to deal with this in more detail, but the Sirah, of course, some of the famous early ones by Al-Waqidi, by Ibn Ishaq, and others that wrote those early Sirahs. Right? And then these were, developed and discussed by later Muslim scholars and historians. Right? So we'll track this development to a certain extent. But here again, the idea is what emerges is the understanding of the broader biography of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And most of the Sirah literature will be divided into these 4 sections. Right? They often begin with a brief overview of the pre-Islamic period. All right, so what was the world, the Arab world that Muhammad was born into? All right? What was Mecca like? What was the Arab culture, Arab religion, the customs, the habits of the Arabs in the period just before Muhammad's birth, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This is a very large portion of the Sirah. It's just sort of setting up the background to the time of Prophet Muhammad. The second period, or the first part of Muhammad's life, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is from his birth until the beginning of Revelation. Right. So this looks at some of the issues related to his birth, the stories that we have about his early childhood, up through to his you might say teenage years in the care of his uncle Abu Talib, into his 20s when he eventually marries Khadija, all right, and taking us up to his late 30s or so, just before the time that the revelation begins. Right? So the third section of the Sirah, right, or the second part of Muhammad's life itself, is what we call the Meccan period, when the revelation begins, right, in the year 610 of the Common Era, and then for the next roughly 12 years up until the Hijrah. Muhammad is preaching in Mecca, and all the events, all the things that take place, who becomes Muslim, how do they convert, what is the situation of the Muslims, right? What's going on in the Meccan period. So that's the third section. And the fourth section of the Sirah, or the third or last part of Muhammad's life, of course, is the Medinan period. Right? Of course, this is from the Hijrah on, after the Hijrah takes place, and this is really the most extensive part of the Sirah literature. We know the most about Prophet Muhammad ﷺ from this time period. Right? The period of his life before revelation begins, we have very little information. Right? He wasn't a famous man in his tribe. He wasn't a great leader. He wasn't a tribal leader. He wasn't a great wealthy merchant. Right? He had a very honorable reputation. He was called Al-Amin, and we know a few things about him. Right? But people weren't focused on him. Right? People weren't paying attention to him. Even in the Meccan period, it's longer. There's more details. Right, after the revelation begins. Right. But again, it's focused mostly on the core of Muhammad's teachings and the persecution, the reaction of the Meccans in particular against Muhammad and the Muslims. Right. And we know that there weren't that many. Right. He was not in a, you might say, historical context, successful in the preaching in Mecca. Right. We do know, for example, that roughly about 80 people had to make the first migration to Abyssinia. Right? And when Muhammad makes the Hijrah, and his companions who were with him in Mecca, the Muhajirun, the group that becomes known as the Muhajirun, were only a couple hundred, maybe a little bit more than that. So we're not talking about a large number of people. Right? And so, of course, the reports are going to be limited in scope, in terms of who's paying attention to Muhammad and who's reporting this. Now, when we get to the Medinan period, this is the most extensive part of the Sirah. Right? Because we know once he comes to Medina, alhamdulillah, the Ansar there, the people of Medina who had converted, had welcomed Muhammad and the Muslims from Mecca, and all of a sudden we have thousands and thousands of Muslims. Right? We have a whole city practically. Right? Yes, there were people there that were opposed to Muhammad. There were Jewish tribes in Medina. There were the group known as the hypocrites. It was still a very difficult situation during that time. But now we have a much more detailed history of Muhammad, a much more detailed biography, and this will include all the different aspects of Islam. Right? Far more details about the life of the Muslims and all the ritual activities and prayers and fasting and all the laws that are developing, the laws related to marriage and divorce, inheritance, business transactions. So the whole scope of what becomes the Sharia is really developed during that time period in Medina. So we have these two basic topics to look at in terms of the passing on of the early information. Right? The Maghazi literature, right? And then the Sirah literature. Right? And of course, this is just looking at the historical aspect, the transmission of the Quran, the transmission of the tafsir, the commentary on the Quran, all of the legal issues that will emerge in terms of the Sharia, right? The full scope of Muhammad's Sunnah. All of this is part of this transmission, but as I said, we're looking at the historical aspect here. Okay, so with that general overview of what we were talking about in terms of Maghazi and Sirah, we'll move on now to the first part here of session 2. And this is a look at the Isnad, or the Isnad system. Right? What exactly is an Isnad? Most of us, again, know about the Hadith. Right? We always talk about Hadith and Sunnah. Right? But here we have to get into the particular historical issue of how this knowledge is transmitted. Right? How do we know Muhammad ﷺ made a hijrah? How do we know there was a battle of Badr? Right? Or the details of this? Okay? So all of this information. Right? So it's a very basic question. How do we know what actually happened? Right? And this is something that, of course, understood by the Sahaba, experienced by the Sahaba. And this is a look at the Isnad or the Isnad system.